morning, colleagues. I wanted to take this opportunity to share how the work that I've been doing so far in my life, how that's taught me about the broader consequence of abuse, and in particular domestic violence. Many of you know that I'm from Washington, D.C. I've been working in Washington, D.C. for easily 30 years, and most of that had been in community-based organizations where we worked on particularly the prevention of child abuse and neglect. And in the work of working in child abuse and neglect, you become very clear about how domestic violence and child abuse and neglect are linked. And then you begin to see that there's a continuum that basically has made it clear to me that all abuse is linked. And so I wanted to just take a couple minutes to talk about how the abuse that begins at home can be linked to the abuse that we have in the streets and in the jails, and how it predisposes people to be in circumstances. And so you saw in the photo, in the video, and the witnessing that we got about domestic violence. And so it's clear that sometimes domestic violence involves the abuse of children in the household. Now, sometimes is the wrong word. It always involves the abuse of children, because as long as children witness domestic violence, they're already being abused. And yesterday we talked about trauma and the implications and what happens to our own police officers as they see repeated situations of trauma, how they close in, they become isolated, they do the them versus we, with children are going through that experience as well, and it has an accumulated effect on them. Well, so not only are children who are in homes of domestic violence more susceptible to bullying, not only do they receive the bullying, but sometimes they cause the bullying. They're sometimes involved in hurting animals, or they're sometimes involved in really hurting other children in significant ways. So the abuse that they saw at home rolls up into behavior that they themselves commit or are susceptible to. In addition to that, we know that where there's domestic violence, there's a greater tendency for there to be substance abuse. And so, and not only substance abuse by the perpetrator in the family, but eventually, in many cases, you see it come up in the children, in particular when they're adolescents and they've had accumulated exposure to violence, whether it's in the home, and then they see it in the environment around them, and then they experience some of it in school. They have a tendency to also try to quell that, to subdue that feeling, and so they become users of alcohol or marijuana. And for instance, don't be fooled, some of the discussions that we have now about marijuana, where we don't really look at the long-term impact of marijuana, the susceptibility that happens to children, to adolescents, male or female, when they're in environments where there is marijuana. And that's a starter drug, and then that can often lead to other drugs. In addition, so I'm all the way now in this cycle. Notice I begun over here by domestic violence, and now I'm here. I'm talking about adolescent kids who can in fact then have several years of their life delayed because of the cycle of abuse of drugs. And that also makes them susceptible to being runaways, to finding themselves in situations where they're exposed to sexual abuse. And it's not only girls. We talk about the girls, but it's also happening to boys. Kids who are runaway are also exposed to human trafficking and to increased substance abuse. And that goes on, so you can see how that cycle can come then to an adult who is confused, feels that they don't have hope, find themselves in situations where they didn't finish their schooling, they don't have any trade or skill, and that often then in the positions of, well, what am I going to do to survive? And they reach out, or they are attracted or pulled into, or their predators are looking for young people and young men and women in those conditions, and they become involved in other criminal acts. And then we get to the jail. Bob and I were talking about, if we look in our jails and we track how many of people who are inmates were from homes of domestic violence and or child abuse. So you can see, I could go on, but you can see how this is all linked. It forms a cycle. Abuse, all forms of abuse is linked, and all forms of abuse lead to trauma. And accumulated trauma that's not helped, it's not worked on, creates deep injury, and we've been talking about that. But I want to say that, to me, there's, on top of everything I just said and we heard today, right, that's significant, the most significant thing to me is that domestic violence and the subsequent cycles of abuse, what they lead is they distort who God is for our children and for ourselves. Because men are important to families. They're important to me as a woman, they're important to my daughters, they're important to my sons. Men are important. When abuse happens in the home, it shifts how children and women view men. And it also puts into question whether God exists. So to me, the biggest violence that we do is we put God in question. And so what happens is sometimes people go into deep holes where there is no God. Where it takes a while for them to reconnect, to find God, to trust God, to be with God. And what happens also is that the children may take longer because they don't have the resources that we have. So while a woman may have been holding on to God all along and could recover a child, if that's what they see every day, already questioning God. So imagine what it takes when you're a child and you're questioning God, how long it could take to get back to God. So that's what I wanted to share. I hope that we begin to see that one of the biggest threats that we have in our country is what's happening in our own homes. Thank you, my colleagues.